My name is Matthew for sure, and today we're talking about Mark Ward attacks the idea of a perfect English Bible. What are we talking about? We're talking about Bible translation. My website is BibleProtector.com. I stand for the King James Bible, and that the King James Bible is a correct and proper translation of the Scripture, and we have it exactly in English. That means you can rely on it fully in every verse and every place, what it's saying, that the meaning is ascertainable, that the exact wording is used with the exact sense. We can understand it. Mark Ward calls himself a mainstreamer. He's presenting the mainstream view, the view of the majority, and he's unwilling to engage with King James Bible supporting Calvinists, ones that are called confessional Christians, ones that are they call it confessional bibliology. It's a viewpoint that's based on the Westminster Confession. He's unwilling to engage with them anymore because he just couldn't make any headway with them, so he had to retreat. And he calls them his brothers, and yet he basically says it's a sectarian and twisted viewpoint. Well, be that as it may, I think that Mark Ward is gravely mistaken in his attacks on the King James Bible, and what we're talking today about is that the King James Bible translation is correct, and we're going to look at just some things related to that in brief. Mark Ward says that he does not condemn the King James Bible and claims, he says, that he says nothing against or negative about the King James Bible. Well, that's a real issue, because he says plenty of things against the King James Bible, so he can't be a lover of it. Why? Because he's produced numerous videos attacking the King James Bible's language, claiming that those who support it are absolutists, and he's presumed that his own modernist position is unassailable. So he's pretty strong and pretty committed to his viewpoint, and so that's not one of being pro-King James Bible. No, he undermines its language, he attacks its language, he says that it's hard to understand. He's not there to help people to promote the King James Bible. No, he's there really, he's being paid to do it, no doubt, to support modern scholarship such as the use of the ESV and to promote the interests of, for example, Logos Corporation and others. That's clearly his agenda. Here is an example of Mark Ward's ignorance. He claims that the King James Bible supporters do not have a historical way of interpreting Psalm 12. Yet John Calvin knew of two ways that psalm could be interpreted. Let's have a look at his commentary as translated from French. Some give this exposition, this is a quote from Psalm 12 verse 7 in his commentary, some give this exposition of the passage, "Thou wilt keep them, namely thy words, but this does not seem to me to be suitable," says John Calvin. David, I have no doubt, returns to speak of the poor, of whom he had spoken in the preceding part of the psalm. So here we got people today saying, well, the King James Bible, interpreters are interpreting today are interpreting Psalm 12 to mean a certain thing, to mean that Psalm 12 is talking about God preserving his words, and that's not what it means. Well, that's not a new and made up thing by King James Bible only people. This is a historical interpretation that John Calvin knew about. Now, it happens that John Calvin didn't agree with that view. However, the fact is that such a viewpoint is a historical one that came from before the time of John Calvin. So this is where we see, quite a lot of ignorance from those who are against the perfection of the King James Bible, because they've got they've got their set of books and their set of who they listen to and their information and their insights, and oftentimes it is biased and prejudiced in a particular way, not to accept the actual facts. Mark Ward calls King James Bible supporters twisted, claiming that they must support the King James Bible at all costs. In other words, it's just irrational. Mark Ward's position is one of imperfection in text and imperfection in translation at all costs. Now, because we're really talking about translation here, we're going to get into that a little bit. it wouldn't matter what Scripture said, the mainstream Enlightenment philosophy in his own choice says otherwise. In other words, he's going to believe it's imperfect in its translation no matter what. He thinks, as is, of course, the mainstream view, is that a translation could not be the same as its original, that it must be somehow a lesser form. Let's have a look at the Scripture itself. In Romans chapter 16, look at verse 25, says, "Now to him that is of power to establish you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus Christ, according to the revelation of the mystery which was kept secret since the world began." And Romans 16 verse 26 says, "But now is made manifest, and by the scriptures of the prophets, according to the commandment of the everlasting God, made known to all nations for the obedience of faith." This is a key verse, one of plenty of verses, but one we'll just take a moment to look at in some detail. So let's look at this. What's this really saying about, is perfection of translation possible, and should it be expected? Well, according to the Scripture, yes. Let's have a look. Here's some points I've made. Scripture is made known to the nations. Okay. Now, if you take that in a general sense, you would say translation, therefore, is a good thing to make the Scripture known to all nations. But if you take it in its ultimate or anagogical form, that is to say, how is it being made known to the nations in one perfect form? Ultimately, you could argue that it's the Scripture in English. It's being made known to the nations. Now, that's an ultimate form, because not even today is that fully realizable, in the sense that there are plenty of people still not speaking English at the moment on the planet Earth. Okay, so the idea that the Scripture is made known to the nations in itself is a concept that the Scripture means Scripture, not variations or what may or may not be, but the actual doctrine and concepts of Scripture itself has to be made known, which means translation would naturally have to be fairly accurate, and in fact quite accurate, but the implication is that there should ultimately be a perfect and accurate translation of the Scriptures for the nations. So this requires translation for the message to be made known. I mean, how can people know the message of the gospel, message of the Old Testament, message of the Scriptures, unless, of course, the message and the very Scripture itself is translated? That makes sense. Therefore, the Scripture must be properly translated into English. This is indeed what we believe the King James Bible is, that the King James Bible itself is that vehicle of making the Scripture known to the nations. Notwithstanding, before this and through time, there's been plenty of mechanisms of what Scripture is being made known to what nations are. For example, the fact that the originals were already making known the message, and that the Scripture being translated, because the New Testament was written in Greek, so the Scripture going to the Greek parts of the world, Greek-speaking parts of the world, yes, but the Scripture being translated into Latin would speak to more, and so on. So we can see that Scripture being made known to the nations required the fact of its translation. But what we're implying is not just the fact of its being made known, but the quality of what's being made known. In other words, not partial translation or not partial knowledge being conveyed, but full and proper knowledge being conveyed. There's many other scriptures to look at and that could be looked at, and you can think about the Great Commission where Jesus talks about teaching nations, and the fact that he says to get the nations to observe all what is commanded. Well, that means every word of Jesus, not added to and not detracted from, because if we're dealing with law here, and in the sense the New Testament gospel as, we'll say, the power and in essence the law of liberty, then you can't have a law that has uncertainty of its wording or what doctrine belonged or didn't belong or what words belonged or didn't belong, because variation in words, variation in meaning particularly, is very important. Interpretation relies on accurate translation, which in turn relies on divine origin of inspiration. Now, if we know that the Scripture was inspired, we know that it's been pervaded and conveyed through time and made known to the nations, as in spread abroad. And we know that translation has been made from the forms that were available, particularly from Greek and Latin and other witnesses, but particularly Greek, and as well Latin being common and current in early Reformation times. Then we know that the Scripture is being made known. We know that people are able to observe all things that Jesus has commanded, because that is a natural fulfillment of his promise. So we're not reading the Scripture as if it's just broad statements. We're reading it as in it's a specific promise that the nations do exactly know and can exactly access what is the Scriptures or the prophets, for example, or the message of the gospel, the mystery. So this is really, really important. And because there has to be one, it has to be particular, ultimately we can point to and see consistency between the providences of the King James Bible and how this verse is being fulfilled in time and will be fulfilled into the future. There's a lot more that could be said about this, but I've kept it brief. And for more information in general, you can look at all the different media related to my website BibleProtector.com. I have various books and uploads. If you search through my website, you'll find them on various topics through the forum. I've listed some books through the prophecy page on my website. Also, of course, many YouTube videos as well, teaching and going through on various topics. God bless, and you take care to keep in the truth.